So we're looking at these fallacies of presumption where you commit them in one way or another by making an unjustified assumption. And we saw that one of them is a false analogy where you might cite some things that have nothing to do with the analogous feature that you're trying to conclude, And so your book shows you that it's actually a good and not a fallacious argument to assume that more water can flow through a big pipe, and as a result, more electric current can flow through a big wire. That actually is a legitimate argument, but it would be wrong to single out a factor like the influence of gravity that will affect the flow of water through a pipe, but will have nothing, to do with the flow of electricity through a wire. And so you can't say that the flow of electricity in a wire is somehow affected by gravity. That would be a fallacious argument. And we saw that Hume tries to say that you can't conclude from the superficial similarities that blood and sap have. Blood flows through, vessels in the body. Sap flows through little tubules in a plant. But from those superficial similarities, you can't conclude that blood circulates in plants as it does in animals. In fact, this is one of the problems with scientific research. This is why they don't stop with animal studies. Because if a drug seems to treat a disease or help it in some way in, say, lab rats, it does not mean that that is going to translate over into effectiveness in human beings. The next step is to actually do clinical trials of the drug with real-life human beings, because we don't know. You don't know always if things are analogous. I just bought a chocolate bar from somebody who's selling them on campus, right? Humans like chocolate, but we know that even though there are many similarities between the bodies of cats and dogs, it would be very wrong to give a dog a piece of chocolate, because that can really harm them. That there are dissimilarities. So, okay, I don't know what I hit that all of a sudden sent me back. Hold it. Okay. Well, okay. So we're in a fallacy. So we saw circular arguments. And again, you can have a viciously circular argument. This is the third kind illustrated on, I think it's page 157 or something of your logic text. And we went through this before. In a viciously circular argument, you start and end up back at the same place. The Earth is experiencing global warming. What makes you sure? Many renowned scientists claim we are. How do they know? Why, they have statistics, and you might say computer models to prove it. How do they know that their statistics show global warming as opposed to just a merely cyclical phenomenon? Well, these experts are sure it's global warming. So you're kind of back where you are, and you haven't really established much of anything. Well, we saw that you can build into a question an unspecified assumption. So a complex question is not an argument by itself, but it sort of prompts the person you ask the question of to construct a simple argument. So have you stopped, you know, the simplest example of a complex question is the old lawyer's question. Have you stopped beating your wife? Answer yes or no. And we looked at this before. Either way you answer, you somehow admitted that you have beat your wife. And so, you know, these are just some examples. Are you still a lousy housekeeper? Assumes that you are, right? How are you going to defend your poor Senate voting record? I've actually heard reporters ask questions like this, but it's basically a complex question, and the question assumes that the voting record is poor. Well, we saw that an either-or argument can be a valid argument, can be a good argument, but the fallacy here is not a dichotomy. Die, you might recognize the prefix. What does die mean? Two, yeah, right. Tome is a Greek word for cut. Literally, dichotomy means to cut in two. But in an argument, in an either-or argument, a legitimate dichotomy is valid in a situation where there are legitimately only two options to consider. So if you eliminate one of them, you can logically conclude that the other option is true. But what happens in a false dichotomy is the person who commits the fallacy, the arguer, presents two options as if they were the only two, when they really are not, and usually eliminates the one they don't want you to conclude and leaves you with the other one. And I said this was one I got off the internet. Either you love Justin Bieber or you're jealous of him, and so you don't like Justin Bieber, so the reason you don't like him is so you must be jealous of him. You're jealous of Justin Bieber, and I like Justin Bieber. No, I mean, maybe he doesn't care at all about Justin Bieber one way or another. In other words, these are not the only two options, and so it's not a good argument. Because even if you eliminate one of the options, it doesn't mean that you're logically entitled to conclude that it's the other. See, if options are exhaustive, it means they exhaust all the possibilities. And a dichotomy argument where the options are exhaustive is where they're the only, literally and legitimately the only two options. Here, these aren't exhaustive, and they're not mutually exclusive. You know, I mean, I guess you could like Justin Bieber but still be jealous of him. I don't know. In other words, they're not mutually exclusive. One doesn't necessarily eliminate the other. And so it's a bad argument. Got this off the internet, but I thought it was a great example of it. Well, I mean, I'm kind of reviewing a few of the ones. The fallacy of suppressed evidence. Well, the total evidence requirement, which I think is somewhere earlier in your text, on something like page 47 or 49, in an inductive argument says, in a legitimate inductive argument, you should take into account in your argument all the relevant evidence that you know of, you know. the suppressed evidence, the fallacy of suppressed evidence, is committed when somebody knowingly omits a very important, crucial piece of evidence. And usually it's a piece of evidence that, if included, would probably lead to the opposite conclusion of the one the arguer wants to argue for. So frequently, because somebody has a point of view to push or an agenda to push, they'll leave out a piece of crucial evidence. And so that's how this fallacy is committed. And I gave you an example of that where in the Republican primary, and you can go back and look at the integrity file for this if you weren't there, where in the Republican primary, Gingrich basically criticized Romney for being a part of a Wall Street corporate raider type firm, and was saying that he himself doesn't really care much for the Wall Street corporate raider life or crowd. But then the piece of evidence he leaves out is that he once worked for the same type of firm. Not the same one that Romney worked for, but the same type of firm. And so, that would lead to a different conclusion. If he admitted that he once worked for the same type of firm, then how is he now trying to pretend that he's, against that type of a company? So suppressed evidence, and this is the one I was talking about. That's here. I was thinking it was. So equivocation occurs. This is where we left off last time. Don't worry about the term fallacy of four terms. We haven't looked at classical logic yet. So some semesters I've done that before looking at the fallacies. But a classical syllogism has only three terms. That is, three words that designate classes of things. And the fallacy of four terms comes in when a word is used with two different meanings. So it actually specifies not one class, but two separate classes. So it's as if you had four terms. So the arguer's intended meaning is usually not the one that the listeners understand commonsensically when people use this fallacy, or when an arguer changes the meaning. And you get this a lot when a word is used in one sense in the premises of an argument, and in a different sense in the conclusion. So, ambiguity. And this actually was a real firm. Our hamburgers are made with 100% pure beef, right? Well, now what do you think? I mean, you think, well, they're all pure beef. All of the hamburger is pure beef, right? I mean, that's what you think commonsensically. But note, the phrase "made with 100% pure beef" need not have that meaning. The one that we usually conclude, or people would conclude when they heard the ad, is that all of the hamburger is 100% pure beef. But "made with" can also mean made with 100% pure beef as one of the ingredients, and some fillers added in so that the whole hamburger was not 100% pure beef. You see the difference? And so they're using the phrase made with 100% pure beef with two different meanings. And they said, well, what we meant is just that it's made with 100% pure beef as one ingredient. Sara Lee said it had a new line of light desserts, and people think light, they think lower in calories, and that is one meaning of light. But when pressed on it, Sara Lee said, well, all we meant was that these desserts are lighter in texture. They don't have fewer calories. And so, you know, you're committing a fallacy of ambiguity because you're using the same phrase or word with two different senses. And like I say, usually in their minds, you know, it's understood in one way by the listener and a different way. I think Dahl had an ad that said it was the best deodorant soap you could buy, and then when they were pressed on it for false advertising, they said, well, all we meant was that it's as good as any other deodorant soap is a good deodorant, which is a good deodorant soap. We weren't claiming the superiority of our product. And there was a recent court case. All of us have heard, you know, better ingredients, better pizza, Papa John's, you know, and Papa John's was taken to task for, you know, claiming they had better ingredients, and so he again retreated basically the same way, saying, well, we're not saying they're any better than the ingredients of other good pizza places. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this in my, we're looking at the theory of utilitarianism in our intro class, but there's a good practical lesson in this one. Here's a famous 19th century philosopher, John Stuart Mill, who wrote a lot in ethics, founded the ethical theory of utilitarianism, a moral theory with tremendous influence in our culture. Cass Sunstein in the Obama administration wants every federal policy decision to be made on the basis of a utilitarian cost analysis. He himself has admitted to being a utilitarian. Our entire criminal justice system, some of you are criminal justice majors, is based on utilitarian reasoning. How do we morally justify incarcerating somebody? 3 reasons, right? Protection of society, rehabilitation of the inmate, deterrence. All of them have to do with weighing the cost of incarceration over the perceived benefits to society for doing it, or weighing the pain you cause somebody by incarcerating them over the good for society you're hoping to do. So here's a famous ethicist. But if we were in 19th century America, and I'm a professor at a university or a college, and I think, well, I got to teach a course in logic next year, I got to order some kind of a textbook in logic. What are some of the better ones out there, and which should I order? Well, one of the top textbooks used in the 19th century was a textbook in logic by John Stuart Mill. Okay? And yet, when he comes to write his own defense, of pleasure as the ultimate thing to be pursued in ethics, as a goal in ethics. In other words, bring about make the moral choices that bring about the most happiness and the least pain and suffering in society as a whole, because happiness is to be pursued as a good for its own sake. And he tried to argue this, but very famously in his argument, he tries to argue that happiness is desirable, and he says, well, how do we know that a sound is audible or something? Well, it's that it's able to be heard. How do we know that pleasure or happiness is desirable as a goal? Well, people actually can and do desire happiness. Well, that's how he uses the word desirable in his premise. But what he's trying to conclude is not just that pleasure or happiness is something that's able to be desired by people, but that we all ought to desire it as the end goal of ethics, that the whole goal of ethics is to produce a society with the most happiness and the least amount of pain for all concerned. Well, there you're using desirable in the sense, the normative sense that it's what people ought to be desired. And so that's his conclusion, but he's used the word in a different sense in his premises. So here's somebody who wrote a logic text who makes a Logic 101 error and commits a standard fallacy of equivocation and, ambiguity, using a word desirable in two different senses. One sense in the premise, one sense in the conclusion. So it's easy to do. Now, I used to tell people, look, don't even worry about Amphiboly. But I've become convinced that it's worth covering this fallacy. Amphiboly is where it's not that a word or phrase has two separate meanings itself, but that the syntax, what is the syntax of a sentence? It's how the sentence is structured. That basically a phrase is used in a way that it can be read in two different ways. And that's how you commit the fallacy of amphiboly. So the fallacious arguer, and usually it occurs when somebody points out, and by the way, I passed around the roll. If you missed it, just sign it on the way out. I wasn't even home last night, so I don't have my usual stuff with me. So at any rate, where the arguer focuses on something someone else says that is syntactically ambiguous, that can be taken both ways, and usually takes it the way they probably don't mean it, right? So selecting that person's unintended meaning, the fallacious arguer draws from it an unsupported, usually unlikely conclusion. And this is the kind of thing that that a lot of humor is based on, right? Should fried chicken be eaten with the fingers? No, the fingers should be eaten separately. Well, of course, the phrase "with the fingers" can be taken two ways, right? Eaten with the fingers by picking it up, right, instead of using a knife and fork, or should it be eaten as a side dish along with eating the fingers? Well, people don't really mean it that way, but and it's a joke to say it that way. So you would say, well, why do we even spend time on a fallacy like this? Well, it actually is, and I think your book does a good job of pointing out that even though there are these humorous, trivial occurrences of amphiboly, you can also get phrases in serious legal documents, like a will, that open themselves up to being read two different ways. And the question is, how did the deceased person mean it? And this is an example from your text. Somebody says in their will, dear departed Aunt Sarah, right, I leave my 500-carat diamond necklace and my pet chinchilla to Alice and Teresa, right? Well, did they mean I'm leaving both of these things to both of them together, and they could sell them and divide up, things between them? Or did they mean respectively? Well, a lot hinges on. In other words, another way you can read this is, I leave the 500-carat diamond ring to Alice, and I leave my pet chinchilla to Teresa, right? And Teresa might have something to say about that, right? So even though there are these humorous instances of amphiboly that occur, a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch sayings were a lot like that. Throw grandfather down the stairs his hat, right? Well, we don't mean that you ought to throw grandfather down the stairs, but that you ought to throw him his hat down the stairs, but you can interpret that syntactically two ways. And so, there can be serious instances in things like a legal document where if somebody's not careful, they can open things up to, to two equally good interpretations. So, the famous popular theologian and Christian writer C.S. Lewis, and he was also a high-powered English professor with an advanced degree, and who taught very serious literature and English courses, besides writing things like the Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis used to say that readers are like sheep. You give them any way to stray off the path and they'll take it, So he thought, writers, people need to be careful, how they construct their sentences, So amphiboly can occur in serious situations where something's on the line. So it differs from equivocation. Equivocation springs from an ambiguous word or phrase. In other words, from a word or phrase that itself, out of context, just has two separate meanings. Amphiboly springs from a syntactical ambiguity. In other words, from the way a sentence is structured in a statement offered by someone other than the arguer. And it can be serious. So here, usually somebody commits the fallacy of amphiboly by intentionally misreading or misreading what somebody says or has written in a way that favors them. but that may not have been the way it was intended. So that's Amphiboly. There are two other fallacies of equivocation, and basically, I can tell you that a lot of students get these wrong simply by not concentrating on which direction you're going. A fallacy of composition goes from part to a whole. In other words, a part in the premises and talking about a whole class of things or group of things in the conclusion. And basically, it's a fallacy of division. I probably should have written it there because the camera picked it up. Goes from a whole in the premises to a part or to parts in the conclusion. So the trick to keeping these two separate and to getting it right is to ask, well, which direction are things going in? So composition, you're composing a whole. So you're talking about parts in the premises and a whole in the conclusion. Division, you're going from a whole thing in the premises and you're dividing it up in the conclusion. And so, why is it a fallacy? Well, and it's not always a fallacy to reason this way, right? But essentially what you do is and this is why it's a fallacy of presumption, why you're making an assumption that you don't have and that you're not entitled to make. You assume that something that's true of an individual thing is also true of an entire collection or group or class of things. So, in other words, you're assuming that what is true of the part is true of the whole. And you're wrongly assuming that. I mean, suppose you had a bag of little candies that individually were low in calories, right? So the parts are these individual little candies, but suppose you're on a diet, you can't say, well, okay, what's true of the parts must be true of the whole, in this case the whole bag. So you can't say, well, okay, there aren't many calories in each individual candy, so there must not be many calories in the whole bag of them, so I think I'll eat the whole bag of them. Well, you know, here you would assume wrongly that what's true of the parts is true of the whole, right? So that would be a fallacy of composition. You're going from what's true of the individual pieces of candy to what's true of the whole. In this case, the whole is the whole bag of candy. And here's the reverse. Suppose a painting happens to be included in a valuable art collection. Well, we make an unjustified assumption if we conclude that every single painting in the collection is valuable just from knowing the fact that the collection as a whole is valuable. So here we're going from the whole, in this case the whole collection of paintings, and we're saying what's true of that whole collection is that it's valuable. It's a valuable collection. And we're saying, well, that must mean that each individual painting is valuable on its own, and not necessarily. You know, so this painting was once part of a valuable art collection, so it must be worth a lot of money. Not necessarily. If the collection as a whole is valuable, it does not follow that each member of it is. So it's a fallacy of presumption because you're presuming that what is true of the whole is true of each individual part, and that's not necessarily the case. Now, here we're not going to go here. These, and I don't know why I didn't edit these out. I think originally I thought, well, maybe I'll add some more fallacies in. Some of these were discussed in Copy, where he covers some more. I mean, it goes both ways. Your book covers some Copy does not deal with, and Copy covers some that your book doesn't cover. But basically, anything on test 2 is going to end with composition and division. Don't worry about the fallacies of inconsistency. So I haven't decided all the particulars about the test, except that I can tell you it is not going to be Friday. It would be Monday at the earliest, and I'm even debating as to whether or not to give you something to take home. But more on that by Wednesday. I need to make a decision on that. Again, if you missed the roll, if you didn't turn in your homework, lay it on the desk on the way out. If you missed the roll, sign it on the way out. And have a good rest of the Columbus Day. You know, the big day around our house. You know, I hope I be facetious. You know, and we'll see you on Wednesday. And again, let me turn this off. But